Hey Banditos! Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday, June 8th. Wherever you are, perhaps it's hump day, perhaps it's comic book day, or just a Wednesday. But whatever day it is and you're listening to this episode, it's Dollar Bin Bandit Day. I am Joe Marcello.
I'm Warren Phillips.
I'm Mike Farah.
And we are the Dollar Bin Bandits, and today we are proud to bring to you our latest interview with none other than Carl Potts. Carl has had a fascinating career. He is a comic artist, a writer, even a teacher. And early on in his career, he discovered and mentored such comic greats as Jon Bogdanove, June Brigman, Mike Mignola, and a little guy you may have heard, Jim Lee.
Yeah, he was also a big part of the Epic line of comics with Alien Legion, which was really a breakout book in that line of comics. And he talks about that with us as well.
I know him mostly from his work on Punisher War Journal, where the aforementioned Jim Lee got a big boost on those first few issues, where he was doing the pencils over Potts' layout. And he also was an instrumental part of the Epic imprint. So a lot of great stories from that time and a lot of great stories from his career. So let's listen to them. This is Carl Potts.
I'll ask you the same question we ask everyone to start off. How did you discover comics?
I cannot remember the first time I ran across a comic because I was so young when I did. I just always seem to remember them being around. I remember on occasion, like if I was homesick from elementary school, my mother would go to the drugstore and buy a bunch of stuff from the spinner rack to keep me occupied. Unfortunately, her tastes and mine she'd bring back things like Lucille Ball comics, and but they were comics, so I read them. But at that point, I started really getting into the DC war titles, and she didn't feel comfortable buying those, I guess.
So, Carl, you started out on the West Coast, right, if my information is correct, and then moved to New York City, where the locus of, at least the big two, but most of the comic industry was located. And you hooked up with Continuity and the Crusty Bunkers. I would love to hear a little bit about, how that all happened, and also a little bit of background on what you knew of the Crusty Bunkers and specifically that name, because we've heard about them. We've interviewed a number of members of them, and I'm just very curious how that came about.
I think they had another name too, or maybe it was a different crew called Diverse Hands. But I'd first met Neal at my very first San Diego con. Actually, might have been my very first convention, I'm not sure, in '73. It was held at a motel near the airport. I drove my Pinto down from the Bay Area, and there was a hatchback, thankfully, because it also served as my motel room. I parked in the airport parking lot. And so I worked up the nerve to show Neal, ask Neal to look at my portfolio. And it was just really weak stuff and full of all the usual mistakes, like no panel-to-panel continuity stuff. It was more like pin-up cover type stuff. And he looked at it for a couple of seconds, handed it back to me and said, "This isn't really even worth commenting on," and turned around to leave. And I was obviously flabbergasted. And I somehow managed to spit out, "Well, can you at least tell me what to work on?" And he pivoted back around, proceeded to name virtually every aspect of drawing and storytelling that there is, and said, "If you work real hard for at least 18 months, I'd be willing to look at it again." So it was 2 years later when I moved out to New York, and I knew a bit more about the Crusty Bunkers because in the Bay Area, a couple of pros had moved out a couple years before from New York to live in the Bay Area, including Jim Starlin and Alan Weiss and Steve Englehart, Tom Orzechowski, Frank Brenner. Alan in particular had been working as part of that Crusty Bunkers crew once in a while at Continuity. Basically, Crusty Bunkers was a ever-changing group of people who happened to be around continuity when a emergency inking job came in, and it was all hands on deck, and people would ink whatever they felt like inking or could ink or whatever. And it was supervised by Dick Giordano and Neal Adams. And I think Neal and Dick tried to do most of the major figure work, unless somebody came along that had a similar style. Like Alan Weiss had such a similar style that I think that he got to ink probably some more of the figurative stuff and facial close-ups than some of the other people. But so when I moved to New York in summer of '75, Starlin called up a couple of friends of his, Al Milgram and Walt Simonson, who shared an apartment in Forest Hills, New York, and asked them if this kid comes out here, can you put him up till he gets his feet under him? And they said, sure. And they were living in the same building with Howard Chaykin and Bernie Wrightson. So my first day in New York, I got jet lagged from the overnight flight, and I stumble into that apartment building. I'm hanging out with Milgram, Simonson, Wrightson, and Chaykin. It was just, I was flabbergasted at that as well. And then Starlin had flown in the next day, because occasionally he would go back to New York to set up his next jobs. And he took me into Marble, where he introduced me to Archie Goode, and I sold my first piece to Archie. Then he introduced me to the guy running the British reprint department, and I got a handful of jobs out of that I didn't learn till years later. The only reason I got those British reprint jobs where you could do a new splash page for the second halves of each story because they'd split them in half. The only reason I got those is that the editor took Starlin aside and said, I'll give this kid some work if you do a cover for me. And Starlin did that, did not tell me. And I had to learn that from Milgram several years later. But then after a couple of days of that, I called up Continuity and reminded whoever picked up the phone that Neal said that he'd look at my work again. So I went over there, showed him my portfolio, which this time did have some panel-to-panel work in it. And that's when Continuity was starting to package a group of black and white magazine comics based on the TV shows $6 Million Man, Emergency in Space, 1999. And he had a group of us young guys there to pencil the stories, and then they would be inked primarily by Dick Giordano, Neal, and people like Russ Heath and others who would come by who would do the close-ups and the major figures. And then Terry Austin and Bob Wycheck did all the backgrounds. So by the time they got done going over the pencils that us new guys were doing, it looked like we knew what we were doing. They looked professional. And so I got to learn by seeing what I turned in and what ended up getting published and the differences between them. That's mostly how I learned. There wasn't like a lot of like real, specific lessons here and there. There might be a lesson about, so I remember on Emergency, because drawing tires and wheels at 3/4 angles is really difficult with all those ellipses going in and out. And Neal gave me a lesson once on how to do that. That stuck with me. Also, how to do Pine Tree Forest. He showed me how to do that once. $6 Million Man story is jet crashes in the Appalachians, and I got to do all these pine trees. But anyhow, so I ended up working at Continuity for, I guess, close to 5 years, and got into doing storyboards for ad agencies. And eventually that's where I made most of my living for a number of years. I eventually left Continuity to join a large ad agency in New York and worked there for several years. But comics was always my first love. So when I should have been sleeping, I was drawing comics, and not a lot of it got out there, but what did get out there got seen by, I guess, some of the right people. And beginning of 1983, Al Milgram was going to leave Marvel's editorial staff to go freelance. And Jim Shooter was the editor-in-chief at the time, and he didn't think any of the current crop of assistants was ready to be promoted yet. So he was asking around for suggestions on who to talk to about being an editor. And Milgram and Bill Sienkiewicz mentioned me, which baffled me because I'd never talked to either of them about editing. I only half jokingly say maybe it was to get me to stop drawing. So I thought about it a while, and I thought, I'll give it a shot. I'd hung out with Milgram, and I'd gotten to know Louise Simonson a bit before then. And I'd known Archie and Denny for a while. And I really liked that group of people. So I figured I'd give it a shot. And I ended up being there 13 years. So I'd say at least 10 and a half of those 13 years was the best work environment I've ever been with. There was some really bad times towards the tail end of Shooter's reign. And then when the Ron Perlman people bought the company, that was a disaster. But most of the rest of the time, it was the best job I could have ever asked for.
You get off the plane and you're ensconced in like comic book royalty. That must have been quite an experience for you.
I don't know if you remember at the time that that was the time when Wrightson was doing all those incredible wash jobs for Warren. And man, and he was the nicest guy, and not a pompous bone in his body, just one of the nicest people around. And in fact, all of them were just, I don't know, they maybe felt it was like, this naive kid from the California burbs, and they just felt, protective or something. But it was nice. And the range of personalities, Milgram and Simonson are, they're at least somewhat close in personality, but Wrightson and Chaikin were very different than all the others too. So it was quite a range of personalities as well.
We've spoken to a number of people over the past year or so who have just, mentioned that, I think they refer to as like, the comic book creators dorm room or, dorm, because of all the people that lived there, and, they would all be just at all hours of the day working. And, there's like every time they talk about, there's an added chapter to it. There's more people that come and go through that and, have this experience. And it just seems like it I'm sure there was some really crazy stories looking back, as to, what went on. Nothing controversial, I'm saying, but just, in terms of the type of work, you guys are just cranking stuff out, wee hours of the morning, not a care in the world, just to work on this, amazing content.
Yeah. At Simonson and Milgram's apartment, when they shared that, it seemed like almost every night at around 11 o'clock, I think that's when Sunshine, maybe it was Burns and Allen's were doing Burns and Allen reruns. And Walt would make this big, bowl of popcorn, and all four of those guys would come over, and I was there too for some of that, just to take a break from what they were doing, shoot the breeze for a bit, and then go back to their apartments and work. It was almost like just a regular thing. And Walt made good popcorn. So,
the work you did on $6 Million Man and Space 99 Emergency, what was that like for you? Did you have to kind of, you're working on properties that are not necessarily, like they're not like a Marvel specific or something like that. They're another brand's property. Did you have to work with those people in terms of translating what has been on the screen in some form to, an adaptation onto a comic?
No, they were all original stories that I believe most of them are being written by people that were up at Charlton.
Okay.
And, basically the only people I had to please were Neal and Dick. So Neal made us work the same way he worked, which was very new and different to me. He would take an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, fold it into quarters, and each quarter was a thumbnail for a complete page. And so you had to draw on this tiny little thing. So they give us a script, and we'd have to draw in pencil on these tiny little thumbnails. And then Neal would go over it, and with his flare pen, he would either strengthen some of the drawing where it needed it, or just totally draw something else on top of it without even, penciling anything. And watching him do that was, I was just flabbergasted at that as well. I just, how on earth can you draw something totally different on top of something that's already there? You must have such a focus in your brain and a vision of what you're doing that it just obliterates what you're drawing over. Somewhere I still got one or two of those little thumbnails. But after that, we put them in. They had a separate room. They had two large called artograph projectors. Are you familiar with those? No.
Like an overhead type projector?
Yeah, they're giant opaque projectors. These were giant ones that had stands on the floor, and they projected down onto a drawing table, and then you could adjust the two different pieces of it to enlarge and focus it. And so we'd enlarge those little thumbnails onto typical original art size paper, which is about, I guess, 11 by 15 or 10 by 15 would have been the art area, so it would have been 11 by 17, I think. And then do the tight finish pencils. And then after Neal approved those, the main figures and faces would be inked by generally Dick or Neal or Russ Heath or somebody like that. Vincente Alcazar, I think, would visit the studio once in a while, and he'd do some stuff. And then the backgrounds were inked by Terry Austin and Bob Wycheck, and then they'd usually hire somebody else. I think at one point it was Rick Bryant to cut all the Zipatone film for those things. So it was a big production. And then trying to figure out, because a lot of times, that deadlines got tight, so multiple people were penciling the same story, and in addition to all those multiple inkers. So at some point, trying to figure out how much to pay each person for their part of a page must have been a nightmare. I remember we'd have discussions sometimes about that, trying to remember who the hell did what. But it seemed to work out. I don't recall any, major disagreements.
Got it.
I want to jump ahead a little bit to Alien Legion, which I thought was one of the really bright spots of the Epic line. From what I read, you pitched Alien Legion to the regular Marvel line. They said maybe not for us, but Archie Goodwin offered you a shot at it with Epic.
Yeah, well, originally it was, I pitched it to Shooter and as a regular Marvel title. And at that point, they'd come up with what was called a creator deal, where if you created a new property that Marvel was going to own, you would be guaranteed a back end if it was ever licensed or merchandise or dramatic rights were exploited or anything like that. So I figured as long as I had that contract, I would be fine with that, as long as I could do that and edit it, because I didn't have time to draw or write it myself outside of plotting some of the stories. So I came up with kind of a Bible and brought Alan Zalnitz on board and Frank Sirocco to help out on that. But then at some point, Shooter decided that Marvel had a really good policy at that point, where if you are writing or drawing, if you're a staff editor and you're writing or drawing something, you cannot edit yourself, which makes a lot of sense in most cases. Because most of us are blind to our own weaknesses, and hopefully you're being paired up with somebody who can help you cover your weaknesses. In this case, I wasn't writing or drawing. I created the property, but I was going to be editing the work of others. So Shooter initially said that was fine. Then later on, he changed his mind. So I felt, well, now I'm screwed. Not what the hell I'm going to do. But Archie came over and saw me when he heard about this, and he asked me to make it part of the Epic line. So it ended up being the third title at Epic after Dreadstar and Coyote. And it ran there in various incarnations and volumes for, I think, about 9 years.
Yeah. Do you think having the freedom that sort of came with the Epic line helped the book, as opposed to maybe, at the regular Marvel, there might have been a little more cooks in the kitchen?
I think if it had been at the regular Marvel line, it would have been fine as long as I was editing it. But if at some point I wasn't editing it, then Lord knows what would have happened. But Archie, working with Archie, I'd worked with him initially on, I'd created a series called Last of the Dragons that ran in Epic Illustrated and was collected later as a graphic novel. And Archie, at that point, was probably the most admired and respected writer-editor in the business. And right up there next to him was Denny O'Neil. And I got to work with both of them on Last of the Dragons and get to know them pretty well. And Archie was the guy who sold my first piece to Marvel. When Starlin took me up there, I was showing my portfolio to Archie, and there was a science fiction piece I'd drawn in there that he said, I can use this for a subscription ad for a new science fiction mag. And he got Simonson to ink it. But as I'm filling out the paperwork to get paid, his assistant came out with this big batch of pile of unsolicited submissions that had been sent in over the previous month that hadn't been responded to yet. And the assistant had typed up all these polite rejection letters and gave them to Archie to sign. And as I'm filling out paperwork to be paid, on the top of the stack of submissions that are being rejected was the one I'd sent in a month before. So as I'm filling out this thing to get paid, Archie looks down, realizes that it's my rejection letter. It's on the top, signs it and smiles and hands it to me. And that was my introduction to Archie Goodwin's sense of humor.
What do you think it was? Because Alien Legion, found home with Epic. It found a home, I believe, with Dark Horse for a bit. What is it about the story that connected so well with fans that it keeps coming back and coming back?
I believe it's the thematic statement that has never been stated. And that is, at least in the comic, it's never been stated. I've talked about it, but to me, it's a giant extrapolation of World War II. I'm a big World War II history buff. I've got a library that I think is going to cave in my attic ceiling at some point. If you think about it, we conveniently forget we were allied with Stalin during that period. The more democratic and diverse Western democracies were going up against xenophobic fascist states, whether it was Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan. Both of those countries thought that they were superior to any other culture or race. And, the mongrels that were America couldn't possibly put together an army that could stand up to their professional armies. But it was that diversity that was actually, despite the problems, and obviously there were a lot of problems with that diversity, it was ultimately our greatest strength. And, you could have a unit where you had people from all different parts of the country and they had all different trades. In the same unit, you could have someone who was a high school teacher, someone who was an auto mechanic, someone who was a taxi driver, someone who was a farmer, someone who was a cobbler, any number of things, plumber. So all these guys knew how to do all this stuff that if anything happened in the field and you needed any of these things, there was somebody there who knew how the hell to do it. It was just, I think, an overall strength, despite some of the problems that were still obviously around. And so I took that and extrapolated that to the Alien Legion, where you have the ranks of the Legion, which are even more diverse and have more problems, but ultimately their diversity and abilities and strengths often, are basically there to defeat their often, more xenophobic, fascist kind of enemies, although they aren't all like that. But so the basic thematic statement would be something like, despite its problems, a diverse democratic society is ultimately stronger than a xenophobic fascist society. And I think that resonates with a lot of readers on a subconscious level. And that's part of the reason I think it appeals to them. Plus the fact you got a bunch of wonky aliens running around in space shooting things. So there's that. But there's people that I've run into over the years, whether they're fans at shows or seems like half of Hollywood grew up reading and loving Alien Legion. And it's astounding to me that I don't know if you guys know who David Benioff is, one of the main guys on Game of Thrones. He told me that he grew up in Brooklyn reading Alien Legion comics. He was a big Alien Legion fan. And that's one of the reasons why, even in the midst of Game of Thrones, when I'd optioned, or at that point I'd sold my script to Bruckheimer and Disney for Alien Legion, and they hired him to do 3 rewrite drafts. And so the busiest guy in Hollywood between seasons of Game of Thrones was doing rewrites on this. But then after the 3rd rewrite, they fired him and it never did get off the ground. So we're still trying to get that done. Hopefully, keep your fingers crossed. We're still trying to get that.
That'd be awesome.
That project off the ground.
Wow.
We will definitely knock on wood and keep our fingers crossed for that. Would love to see that. So as part of your Marvel editorship, you know, one of your reputations was as a discoverer and mentor of talent. And, you know, people everywhere from, you know, Jon Bogdanove to June Brigman, Jim Lee, Mike Mignola, the list goes on. You know, what was your sort of secret sauce in that department? How did you approach this kind of talent to shepherd them to, you know, stardom in many cases?
Well, the first step is to find them, and that was pretty easy because people were sending their samples into Marvel by the mountain load every day. And the first day on the job, Milgram was still there to kind of help ease me into the position, and we were going through this huge stack of unsolicited submissions that he'd received that had never responded to. These things came in just every day. The mail people would come by and just throw all these things. And we're going through them, and on my first day, I discover Art Adams. And the assistant editor who I was inheriting from Milgram was Ann Nocente, and I showed her his stuff, and she'd been playing around with this wonky idea for a character, long shot, and eventually they ended up doing a miniseries together. But I remembered what it was like sending my work in and never getting a response, or if I got a response, it was a long time later and came with a form letter that really told me nothing useful. So I decided that every submission that came directly addressed to me, not to Marvel in general, but to me, I was going to respond to quickly and tell them something useful. And that was a big mistake because I got to be known as the person to send your stuff to if you wanted a response out of Marvel. So I got more and more mail all the time, but I kept up my vow, and that's because, and that I would eventually just, you know, after all these, you know, portfolios would go by with that just weren't showing much promise, eventually I would find somebody. And same thing at conventions, I'd sit there at the Marvel table and just look at portfolio after portfolio. And because again, I remember what it was like to, you know, to be that person waiting to, you know, work up the nerve to go up and talk to a pro and show your work. And I also vowed never to be one of those people that I would run into occasionally, or I saw others were you get some pros that would look at somebody's portfolio and just use what they call the nuke 'em all and let God sort them out technique, where they tell the person that they're just horrible and they'll never make it and they should go pump gas for a living or dig ditches. And their rationale for that is that if that person has what it takes to really make it, they're going to say, screw you, I'm going to show you, and have all this determination to go. That might work for some personalities, but I feel that, you could have basically the reincarnation of Michelangelo, but for somebody who's really timid and, insecure. And if a professional they admire tells them that they're horrible and go dig ditches for a living, they might not pick up a pencil again. And I think too, back that time when Neal told me, my work wasn't worth commenting on and turned around to walk away, what would have happened if I hadn't managed at that last second to at least ask him to tell me what to work on? And it was like a coin toss. It could have been 50-50 for me to do either one of those things. So I would occasionally run into somebody at a convention or a store signing that, was already well into their 30s, and the work was just really so far away from being professional. So the closest I would come to telling them to hang it up would be to say, if you're going to have even the remotest chance of breaking in at a professional level, you're going to have to work on all these things. I'd lay them out that you've been avoiding, learning how to do. Usually it was basics like storytelling, anatomy, perspective, composition. And I'd say, that means you have to work hard on this every day for several years just to have a remote chance of reaching a level where you might be considered at a professional level. And only you can decide at this point in your life whether you have that determination. And I'd leave the ball in their court. But I also had in the back of my mind that there might be people out there that drew in a way that didn't appeal to me, but might appeal to other people. It's like with art, any art of any kind, like I don't get Jackson Pollock. I never have, never will. But there are plenty of people on the planet who love his work, very intelligent people who think it's fabulous. But if Jackson Pollock, the equivalent of Jackson Pollock, had come up to me and showed me comic stuff, I would have said, nah, I don't think so. Not for me anyway. But to somebody else, he might have been like, a revolutionary that come on the scene that, So I always try and keep myself reserved in that regard too, that I wouldn't tell somebody it was just, showing me really bizarre stuff. I'd just say, well, it's not really for me or for my office, kind of thing. But I just, by doing that, I would occasionally run across people that were really talented. And I would usually give them a 6-page story that Tom DeFalco had written called Double Vision, which was a really difficult visual storytelling exercise. There was just a lot of stuff crammed into that 6-page story. And so they basically were being tossed into the deep end of the pool to see how well they dog paddled or swam or did the backstroke. And I'd have them do layouts first, and I'd go over the layouts and do corrections on overlays. Then they do the tight pencils. If they wanted to ink it, they go and ink it, or sometimes I'd save those samples for people who did want to just primarily ink to practice on. So for a while there, I had this huge stack of originals of people that had done the same 6-page story. And at some point during an office move, I lost them all. I don't know what happened to them. I wish I had those. That would have been fun to have. But eventually, just by accident, my office kind of ran like a professional baseball team. My professionals were on my monthly books. My AAA people were working on annuals or fill-ins or limited series, things like that. And my AA people were working on this Vision tryout story. And that way, if I lost somebody, they decided to move on and do something else, I could usually call up somebody from my farm system that had been groomed and was ready. I tried to groom them not just on the creative side, but also on the professionalism side, because you could be the world's best comic artist, but if you want to be on a periodical, but you can't produce periodically, you're not much use to me. So I would train them on being professional as well. But most of the guys that and they grew up in an era where they were all huge X-Men fans. So when they all got popular, the X-Men office would usually come calling on them, and they'd end up over there. So during the early 90s, most of the X-Men titles were being drawn by people that had come in through my office, which was flattering in a lot of ways. But thankfully, I had that farm system kind of going, and I always had my eye out for new talent.
During your time as editor, you produced the first Rocket Raccoon series.
Yeah, it took 35 years to be vindicated for that.
Well, that was my question for you. Who was it, you or someone else in Marvel that figured that this would be an interesting, way to go? I mean, now you mention it, people are like, oh, well, of course. I mean, he's Rocket Raccoon. He's amazing, and obviously the movies help. But who had the foresight to kind of jump into that?
That would be Bill Mantlo. Bill was the co-creator of Rocket Raccoon, and at that point, Mike Mignola was basically an inker. He'd penciled one or two stories, I think, in Fanfare, but that was it. But Mike, when he turned in the ink pages, on the backs, he was always doing these sketches of all these amazing creatures and things, and they were so much better than his inks. And he'll admit that too. So Mantlo and I are looking at these things, and Bill really wants, because at that point, limited series, like 4-issue limited series, had become all the rage, and goes, let's propose doing a Rocket Raccoon miniseries. And we're both looking at Mignola's stuff and go, this is the guy to pencil it. And so I put in the proposal. It got approved, although a number of the editors thought I was nuts for proposing that. And we had a lot of fun with it. I don't think it broke any sales records, but I think we acquitted ourselves pretty well. And but it just kind of, it wasn't like it caught on fire, so it would go to its own ongoing series or anything. And I don't recall there being a huge stampede of people coming to my office asking if they could guest star the character in their titles. But years later, it's weird. It kind of caught on, and now in retrospect, it's become cool, retro cool.
How does it feel to see, that character to where it is now? It's
nice.
Pretty good.
It feels good. I just wish, Mantlo had lived long enough and in good enough shape to have been able to enjoy it.
Is it the same? Has the character changed dramatically or drastically since then till? I mean, I read, what is the version of Rocket Raccoon now, aside from what's in the movies, and I think they've probably tweaked the character to be more in line with the movies.
Yeah, I mean, I think the movie character is, much more kind of snide and caustic, I think, than the original miniseries character was. But that may be what helps his appeal with a large audience. So I was told that that right before he passed away, that they'd given Bill a DVD screening of that first Guardians movie, and that, as far as I could tell, he reacted really well to it. He was not in good shape at that point, but I'm glad he got to see that at least.
Yeah. I want to talk a little Punisher because we had Stephen Grant on a few weeks back, and he was telling us a little bit about how he came up with the story, and then he wanted to pick a character to go with the story, pitched it to you, and I guess it was sort of everyone was a little lukewarm on the Punisher, that he was not seen as a character with much potential. Is that your recollection of how it went?
Yeah, I don't know if Steve said this or not, but I got the impression, and I don't know if it's the correct one or not, that Steve and Mike Zeck had approached one or two other editors before me and hadn't gotten takers. So they go, let's go try the new guy. Mikey likes it. So I'd always loved Zeck's work. And I liked Steve's take on the character. I hadn't really had any real feeling for the character at that point. I thought he was kind of a goofy character early on, and then later, you know, he got more serious with the Daredevil version of him. But that, I think, is something that a lot of people don't give Archie Goodwin credit for. I think my impression is that Miller's take on the character was inspired by the two black and white magazine stories that Archie Goodwin wrote that featured the Punisher. He kind of redefined the character in those. And then Joe Duffy, who worked with Archie very closely, had, I don't know if she proposed it at the same time or before or a little after the Grant and Zeck proposal, but she proposed the Assassin's Guild graphic novel that eventually Jorge Savino was on. They were in production simultaneously. I can't remember which one came first exactly, but they were both being produced simultaneously. And that was another one where some of the other Marvel editors thought, you know, what are you thinking? Why are you doing this? You know, doesn't have superpowers. He's not a mutant. He uses real world weaponry. You know, he's as much a bad guy as anything. But I'd seen, you know, at that time, if you remember, a lot of the films that were coming out at the time, so there was something in the ether with the Dirty Harry films and the Death Wish films and so on. So we put it out there, and it seemed to be, you know, go over really well. It was a big hit. And I started thinking about the character more and more. I got the ongoing series going with Barron and Jansen. I had all these story ideas for the character, but Mike Barron was a fountain of ideas. He didn't need me, you know, helping him come up with ideas. So my thought eventually, after it just kept taking off, was that, you know, it would support a second book, and I'd like to write and hopefully do the layouts on the second book. So I pitched it to Marvel as a 6-week schedule title instead of so I could have time to do all that and still keep my day job. And so they agreed to that. And I was looking for somebody to do the finished art over my layouts. And one day I was talking to my Alpha Flight artist, Jim Lee, who had basically started his career about a year before. And I didn't think Jim would have any interest in working over my layouts. He'd already been drawing on his own for a year on Alpha Flight. So I didn't even ask him, but he heard that I was coming up with this new book, and we talked about it a bit, and he volunteered. So even though I was kind of stealing from myself, I said, sure. But the book ended up catching fire so quickly with sales that they really pretty much demanded it go monthly. And Jim didn't need me or anybody else doing layouts for him. So after the Wolverine Punisher crossover issues, I stopped that, and it went monthly, and I just wrote it after that. But I had it took me a little while, but I worked out a take on the character that I wanted to be consistent, because he's basically a two-dimensional character, and ironically, it's easier to screw up a two-dimensional character than a three-dimensional character. And all these other writers and editors wanted to use him now that he was popular, and they were just coming up with the stupidest stuff sometimes to do with the character. And so I tried to solidify as much as I could what the character was and wasn't about, to make sure everything that was being produced, at least out of my office, or that I was producing, would be consistent. And that was basically, he was someone whose family had been killed by the mob, and he felt tremendous guilt for not protecting them and surviving. So he decided to take on violent criminals that were outside the reach of the law, in order to hopefully stop happening to other people what had happened to him. And he basically had a death wish. I couldn't really decide if it was conscious or subconscious, but a death wish so that, you know, if he succeeded in a mission and wiped out a bunch of bad guys, it was just on to the next one. It gave him no pleasure. There was no sense of accomplishment. There was always more. But if he ever got killed or maimed, then he was getting what he deserved for failing to protect his family. And he couldn't really get close to anybody. Whenever he did, you know, because of the way he lived his life, odds are they weren't long for this world. So he pretty much had to deny himself of real relationships. He was like a sort of a warning tale of what happens when you let revenge rule your life. And strangely enough, some people didn't seem to get that, and they thought he was somebody to be emulated, which baffled me. Occasionally I get a letter from somebody who, you know, said, "Oh, I want to be like the Punisher." And it just drive me nuts that someone was even thinking that way. But later on, when I got promoted to executive editor, back then executive editors oversaw groups of other editors, but they weren't allowed to line edit any books themselves at that point. So the Punisher books, all of them went over to an editor that I felt had no real feel for the character, and basically let a lot of stuff start happening with the character that went against the vision of the character that I saw. And eventually the whole franchise that I've been building imploded and just disappeared. And I think a lot of it had to do with the inconsistency of the focus on what the character was and wasn't. That's my slightly subjective point of view on that subject.
I wanted to jump back with a quick follow-up. When Punisher War Journal came about, and that's the second ongoing for the Punisher character, what is sort of the calculus like, if there is any, editorially? Is it just that this guy is popular, we're going to give him a second book, we don't really need to sort of justify or distinguish that? Or is there really like, well, the Punisher ongoing, the first one, is going to be like this, Punisher War Journal is going to be like this, and then eventually you have War Zone, and that's going to be like this?
Yeah, War Zone came after I got promoted, so I didn't have anything really to do with that one. But my goal on War Journal was the stories that Mike did in the regular ongoing monthly was the character, you hardly ever got into his head. Most everything was done externally. Even when Microchip's son is killed, you know, everything is shown externally. You don't really go in his head. So I decided to use the Punisher's War Journal more often to get glimpses into what was going on inside of him, including his own internal denial about what was going on inside of him. So that was the reason for the title of the book. And, you know, the concept was just, you know, let's look inside this guy's head. So that was the main, at least I don't know that we ever promoted it that way. I think that was just my focus.
That makes sense. I don't think I really ever connected sort of the dots about the actual title of the book with the sort of structure of the story until just now, and that makes a lot of sense, distinguishing it from the first one. So
Yeah, I don't know if it would have helped or if it was better to not really, go out with marketing materials explaining all this stuff, but
I
it
think
was
it
what
did
it
just
was.
fine.
So I wanted to jump over to your time at DC, specifically on something that I'm a huge fan of, and I am at some point I will get all of them, and that is the Who's Who series in the
Uh,
DC universe. I love those. I think they are absolutely just, they're so much fun to read. You just learn about every single character. What was your experience working at DC, first off?
well, actually, some of my earliest story work for comics after the Charlton stuff at Continuity was for DC. I did some Aqualads, Backup Adventures, and Nightwing and Flamebird, all the big names. Uh, and then I actually created a new character for them called Cobalt that I plotted and drew 3 episodes of, but died in the implosion of, what was it, 78, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And it was basically the story of one of the Goodwin Simonson Manhunter clones that had been that wasn't destroyed when everything went kablooey, but had been raised to be a trained killer, but had no moral compass. It was totally amoral and just tossed out into the world. And so it would have been about his growth, learning morality as he went along. And but it died and never got resurrected again. So years later, when I was at Marvel, I called up DC and asked them if I could buy that concept back, and they sold it back to me. And I used some of that in a character called the Mace, which appeared in Venom and then Marvel Comics Presents, and that was going to be kind of my goal at one point was that I was going to do an ongoing Shadow Masters series, and that that character would be involved with that as well. But there aren't enough hours in the day, all that stuff.
Do you get to choose those DC like Who's Who stuff, or they say, all right,
No,
you're number 7, you're number 9, you're this, you're that?
I think it's whatever they offered me. I remember doing with Enchantress, and then there was the Ditko crazy Charlton the Squid Gang or something like that. I can't remember what it was, and whatever. I can't even remember what the other ones are. I get those mixed up with the ones with the history of the Marvel Universe.
Well, they're all the same. Like, that's what, kind of the history of the, all those stuff have evolved from. I mean, the Who's Who is like, I remember, at least when I started collecting, which was in the early to mid 90s, they had secret files or like secret origin issues and stuff like that. And they were just basically reformatted, polished Who's Who type of issues. And it wasn't until digging around the dollar bins with Oren that I started rediscovering them. And I'm like, these are just the greatest things in the world, man. I just find it to be just, short, like, just bios of all the characters, and you learn about characters that you've totally forgotten ever existed, but someone took the time to create this whole backstory and bio on them, and they're just awesome. So,
well, you can thank Mark Grunwald for that, because Mark is the one who started the whole Marvel Universe series of books, and that's what inspired DC's to do theirs. And Mark is like the ultimate, or was the ultimate comics fan, and he knew continuity of both of those universes inside and out from day one. If anybody, any of us, even those of us who grew up reading Marvel, had a question about something, we could ask Mark and he would know it. For a while, Peter Sanderson was running the Marvel library and he had an encyclopedic knowledge too. And then Ralph Macchio, who was also on staff, knew just about everything there was to know. So I was surrounded by people who were even more geeky about the Marvel Universe than I was, which is saying something. So Mark would, do those episodes of the Marvel Universe book, and they would like sometimes to get the stuff out on time. They would work just tremendous hours. They would sometimes stay overnight when they weren't supposed to. At that point, I think at 10 o'clock, the last time the guard would go through the floor and turn on the sonic alarms. So if anything moved, it would set off an alarm. So when they knew they had to work at night, Mark and his group of people, including Mike Carlin and some other people, Elliot Brown, they would prepare, they'd make sure they all went to the bathroom and they had whatever food and drink they needed, and they'd go inside Mark's door and they couldn't come out until that alarm went off in the morning. And they'd just work in there all night long. And then they'd sleep for a while. At some point, they had stuffed away, I think, some sleeping bags and stuff in there.
So coming close to the end of our time here, Punisher sometimes gets the lion's share of the attention, especially in your career. But you had editorial ownership or oversight of so many different titles. Everything from Incredible Hulk, Defenders, Doctor Strange, Moon Knight, launched What the and Power Pack. What were some of your favorites? And I know it's like picking a favorite child, often others have said, but what sort of sticks out in your memory as being, something you were maybe particularly proud of sort of shepherding into the world or through a storyline?
I think the first thing would be Power Pack. Louise Simonson had been successfully editing at Marvel for quite a while, and she doesn't get enough credit for it. She's the one who basically turned the X-Men title into a franchise. She's the one that launched New Mutants and the original Wolverine miniseries and Kitty Pryde and Wolverine. So that was the start of that. But she wanted to write full time, and she'd come up with this concept for Power Pack, and I believe I was the first editor she approached with it. I'm not sure exactly why. Maybe it's because we'd known each other a while, because I'd known Walt since day one when I was in New York. But she also knew that I had very eclectic tastes. I wasn't just into this or that. I wasn't just, solid mainstream Marvel Universe guy. I liked very eclectic things, which is eventually why I think I got asked to take over the Epic line. But she brought her proposal to me, and I just thought it was brilliant. And she had met June a while before, so I started working with June, and she, grew in leaps and bounds on that book as well. Eventually, she left to go do other things, and the trouble with a book that features kids is that very few, even highly accomplished comic artists can draw convincing kids. They really usually look like kind of misshapen, tiny, people, that adults that aren't very attractive. June had a great handle on that. And then one day when Louise Simonson was in my office and we're talking about, who we're going to get to replace June permanently, this guy named Jon Bogdanove had been showing his sword and sorcery material to an editor down the hall, and stuck his head in and asked if he could show his work, and showing this nice sword and sorcery samples, but I didn't really need anything at that point along those lines. So as he's closing his portfolio, those little side pockets, they have a couple pieces of paper float out, and they were sketches of his neighbor's kids that he'd done, and they were gorgeous. So Wheezy thought they looked great too. So that was the start of Jon Bogdanove's career right there. Stuff like that happened at Marvel all the time. It was an amazing place where, creative things just came together. Ideas, people would have just shooting the breeze in the office or going out to lunch or whatever. It was a constant, brainstorming session without trying. There's a story I posted recently on Facebook about a large illustration I'd done of this young woman in space with this little creature on her shoulder that had been done for my illustration rep. And I had that up on my office wall at Marvel. And one day Chris Claremont came by and said, that character looks kind of like Kitty. If you change the character on the shoulder to Lockheed, I'll write a story around it. So that's what I did. And that ended up being the cover of that New Mutants that he plotted and Wheezy did the script on. And just, that's how things happened up there. It was incredible. It's a wonderful place to be. I couldn't imagine a better working environment.
Always so great to hear about a, creative center for so many talented individuals. You often obviously the negative stories always get more attention, but I always like to hear when folks talk about it in such with such praise of having a creative outlet like that.
I don't know if we'll ever get around to doing it, but for years and years there were a handful of us that worked at Marvel during the 80s into the early 90s that were going to do a book on what it was like to be on the inside of Marvel during that period, which ended up being the most successful publishing era of Marvel, and where a lot of the material that's being exploited now in film and television originated from. So maybe someday, maybe a documentary would be better. I don't know. But we better get to it soon. None of us are getting any younger.
You have 3 buyers/viewers right here.
Yeah, really. Least. Keep producing it. We'll keep watching it. That's our motto,
Mm-hmm.
So.
There are just all kinds of inside stuff that we did that went, kind of behind the scenes stuff that it was such a fun place. And Grunwald in particular was basically the heart and soul of the culture there. So the book would end with Grunwald's passing, because that basically was the end of the culture right there.
Yeah. Well, that series Slugfest kind of touched on that type of stuff. So, and that was extremely interesting. So I think
I haven't seen that.
It's definitely worth a watch for anyone, I think, either whether you're in the industry or just a fan. And it shows, all the, at least a little bit of the interesting things that went on behind the scenes, what went into creating these characters. And I'm sure, based on what you're telling us, there is certainly an audience for that, for what you described. So hopefully we'll get to see that at some point.
Yeah, I'd like to. The person that really should have wrote it, though, is Mark, which is the sad part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Carl, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to talk to us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's my pleasure. I'm glad to talk to folks that are, appreciate all the both hard work and fun that my career, included. So.
Absolutely. And we're back. So, what'd you guys think of that episode? I really enjoyed talking to Carl. Again, one of these guys that we've interviewed that I didn't really know a whole hell of a lot about him prior to our interview, but I'm sure glad that we had a chance to speak to him. Great guy to talk to. Fascinating career.
Yeah, Carl has been through so much in the comic book community with Marvel, and been a part of so many huge books, and to be able to sit down and hear his stories was truly an honor.
Joe mentioned this earlier, and it's just great to hear about all the talent that he helped foster in Marvel. The names were given earlier, but also Arthur Adams, Whilce Portacio, Larry Stroman, just the list goes on. So he was really an instrumental part of, making Marvel in the 70s, 80s, and part of the 90s. So hats off to Carl Potts. And this will do it for this episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. Please rate, review, and subscribe, and we will see you next time.